January 1945. The night sky over Japan was unusually still, the winter air biting against the skin of watchful soldiers and anxious civilians alike. From distant airfields in the Mariana Islands, a new breed of bomber took to the clouds, the B-29 Superfortress, massive and gleaming under the pale moonlight. Its engines droned like a distant, ominous storm, a sound unfamiliar to the islanders below. In Tokyo, the city slept unaware. Roofs dusted with winter frost reflected faint light from the streets. Japanese radar stations had picked up aircraft before, but nothing like this. Nothing that flew so high, so fast, and carried such destructive promise. Military leaders in dimly lit command rooms pored over reports, frowning at the intelligence that hinted at an approaching threat they could scarcely counter. Over the mountains and rivers, the first wave of bombers traced silent arcs across the night. Inside the B-29s, crews checked instruments with precision, their faces lit by faint dashboard glow, hearts steady but alert. Each plane carried tons of explosives, each mile flown edging closer to Japan's heart. When the first bombs fell, the Japanese were stunned. Explosions echoed like rolling thunder across the landscape, fires igniting in streets, factories, and homes. Panic rippled through command centers. A weapon they had underestimated, a bomber they had dismissed, now hovered over their cities like a harbinger. The world was changing in an instant. The skies over Japan would never be the same again. And for the men who commanded, planned, and defended, shock was only the beginning. By 1944, Japan's situation in the Pacific had grown perilously precarious. Years of expansion across East Asia and the Pacific had overextended the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy. While they had initially achieved stunning victories, the momentum had shifted. American and Allied forces had regained territories, establishing airfields closer to the Japanese home islands. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, captured in mid-1944, were now springboards for long-range bombing missions, putting Japan within reach of a new type of threat. Japanese cities had already felt the sting of air attacks, though nothing compared to what was coming. Incendiary raids on smaller cities like Kobe and Nagoya had caused localized devastation. Yet the Imperial General Headquarters believed their anti-aircraft defenses and fighter intercepts were sufficient to protect key industrial and urban centers. In truth, Japan's air defenses were increasingly fragmented. Radar networks were incomplete, interceptor squadrons were undertrained and under-equipped, and fuel shortages hampered the mobility of any coordinated defense. The military command understood the stakes. Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya housed not just civilians, but critical war industries, aircraft factories, munitions plants, and shipbuilding yards. Protecting them was paramount. Generals and admirals debated constantly in smoke-filled rooms over the best strategies: disperse industries, reinforce flak batteries, or hope that existing fighter wings could deter the approaching threat. Intelligence reports from captured Allied pilots and intercepted communications hinted at a new type of bomber: large, fast, flying higher than conventional interceptors could reach. Still, many leaders underestimated the technological leap they were about to confront. On the other side of the Pacific, the United States had invested heavily in the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. Designed to fly at altitudes above 30,000 feet, it was capable of carrying payloads of up to 20,000 pounds over distances exceeding 3,000 miles. The enemy's perspective underscored the scale of the strategic surprise. a technologically superior force operating beyond the comprehension of conventional defense, forcing Japan into a reactive, almost powerless position. March 9, 1945. Tokyo lay beneath a moonless sky, its streets quiet except for the distant hum of military vehicles and the occasional train. At precisely 23:30, the first wave of 334 B-29 Superfortresses crossed the horizon. Flying at altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet, they were invisible to the naked eye from the city below. Japanese radar picked up the approach, but confirmation of their sheer number and payload came too late to mount a meaningful defense. Inside Tokyo's Imperial General Headquarters, officers watched projections and maps, disbelief etched across their faces. Reports came in of massive incendiary payloads dropped on densely packed urban districts. Factories, homes, and warehouses erupted in towering columns of flame. The Shitamachi districts, characterized by wooden structures and narrow streets, became instant tinderboxes. The psychological shock to Japan's military leadership was profound. The unthinkable had happened. A weapon they could neither effectively intercept nor predict had devastated the capital in a single night. Commanders debated desperately over immediate responses, the need to disperse industry, and how to adapt to this new reality. The raids had proven the B-29 superiority, exposing the vulnerability of Japanese defenses and shattering any illusions of air superiority. The first B-29 raids were more than a tactical success. They were a signal. Japan's military could no longer dictate terms in the skies over its cities. The next challenge would be whether the defenses could adapt and how quickly the Allies could exploit the disarray. Following the March 9th attack on Tokyo, the raids escalated in both frequency and intensity. In the subsequent weeks, B-29s targeted Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe with relentless precision. On March 13th to 14th, Nagoya, Japan's automotive and aircraft production hub, faced its first major incendiary attack. Over 300 bombers dropped thousands of tons of firebombs, reducing industrial districts and surrounding residential areas to rubble. Factories that had produced Mitsubishi A6M0s and engine components for the war effort were destroyed in hours, effectively crippling local production. Japanese commanders attempted countermeasures, deploying all available interceptor squadrons and increasing flak concentrations, but the results were minimal. Fighters exhausted themselves in futile climbs, often arriving too late or forced to retreat under heavy defensive fire from the B-29s. Anti-aircraft artillery, recalibrated to higher altitudes, still failed to pose a serious threat. For every bomber that returned to the Marianas, Japan lost little in terms of air assets, while the destruction on the ground mounted exponentially. The raids had a dual effect. Materially, they demolished infrastructure critical to sustaining the war effort. Psychologically, they instilled a pervasive sense of vulnerability. Japanese officers reported sleepless nights, constant tension, and a growing belief that the Allies possessed a weapon beyond countermeasure. Some argued for evacuation and dispersion of industries, while others considered desperate counterattacks against the Mariana bases, despite the logistical impossibility. On April 9th, Osaka, an industrial city and transportation hub, became the next target. The raid was meticulously coordinated. Low-level reconnaissance flights had identified key targets, while bombing runs were synchronized to maximize conflagration and strain firefighting efforts. Fires spread uncontrollably through wooden residential districts, compounded by the spring winds. By the time the bombing ceased, tens of thousands of structures had been destroyed, and tens of thousands more civilians were displaced or killed. The scale of devastation was staggering, forcing Japan's military leadership to recognize a new strategic reality. They were no longer capable of defending their home islands from sustained aerial assault. These attacks crystallized the turning point of Japan's defensive posture. No longer could the military rely on traditional tactics or hope for attrition to repel bombers. The B-29 raids demanded an entirely new approach, one that Japan was ill-prepared to implement. The shock, confusion, and devastation set the stage for the aftermath, revealing the profound consequences for military strategy, civilian life, and national morale. By mid-1945, the consequences of the B-29 raids were undeniable. Cities like Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe lay in ruins, their streets littered with rubble and the remnants of families' lives. Industrial production, once the backbone of Japan's war effort, had been decimated. Factories responsible for aircraft engines, naval components, and munitions either ceased operation or operated at a fraction of capacity. The destruction of transport infrastructure further hindered the movement of troops, resources, and emergency aid, compounding the country's vulnerability. The human toll was immense. Conservative estimates suggest that in Tokyo alone, more than 100,000 civilians perished in the March 9th to 10th raid, with tens of thousands more injured or displaced. Across other cities targeted by subsequent raids, casualties continued to mount. Hospitals were overwhelmed, firefighters stretched beyond capacity, and local administrations struggled to provide basic necessities. Reports from Japanese newspapers, often censored but still conveying a sense of urgency, described unprecedented devastation, contributing to national panic and uncertainty. On the military front, the B-29 raids forced a complete re-evaluation of Japan's home defense strategy. The Imperial General Headquarters recognized that traditional methods, relying on interceptor squadrons, flak batteries, and local airfields, were insufficient. Some commanders proposed radical measures, dispersing industrial plants to remote locations, camouflaging factories, and strengthening anti-aircraft networks. However, these efforts were too little, too late. Limited resources, fuel shortages, and a shrinking pool of trained personnel made effective implementation impossible.